Brazil, where he was named Governor Central Banker of the Year by the Banker magazine. He spent also an important part of his career in the private sector in Itaú, Gávea, and other hedge funds in Brazil. Eduardo Levy Yeyati is the Dean of the School of Government at Universidad Torcuato Di Tella in Buenos Aires, the founding director of the Center for Evidence-Based Policy. He's also principal researcher at Argentina's CONICET, a non-resident fellow at Brookings, and he was the chief economist of the Central Bank of Argentina several years ago. Carmen Reinhardt is a senior vice president and chief economist at the World Bank, assuming this role on June 15, 2020. She provides thought leadership for the institution at an unprecedented time of crisis. She also manages the bank's Development Economics Department. She's on leave from Harvard Kennedy School, where she is a Minos Sombanakis Professor of International Financial System. Previously, Carmen was the Dennis Weatherstone Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute and Professor of Economics and Director of the Center for International Economics at the University of Maryland. So we're going to start with a presentation by Ilan and Eduardo, and then we're going to turn to Carmen, and then I'm going to manage a Q&A session. So please keep sending your questions through the Q&A function, and I will try to relate to them as much as possible in the last 10, 15 minutes of our seminar today. So please, Ilan and Eduardo, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the introductions. Nice to have Carmen on board finally. And I will start. Let me share you a brief presentation. It's very difficult to be fair with the incredible amount of important ideas and opinions that are surrounding this conversation. So we're going to try to summarize first the setting and then some of the key ideas just to put on the table what we believe are the key challenges of the post-COVID environment in Latin America. First, for the setting, one thing that if we have to summarize the impact of COVID in Latin America in a few lines, one thing that comes to mind, the first that comes to mind is that Latin America actually performed, was one of the worst performers, both in terms of lives and livelihood, or meaning both in terms of the death toll and the impact on inequality and poverty, and on the strict economic side, because even though the actual COVID shock was not the highest, the strongest in the world, the region actually suffered the most in terms of growth, underperformance, growth contraction, and growth revisions, which is the most important, probably the most important way in which we measure the output impact of the COVID. And the first, natural question, essentially, why was that the case? And the first answer comes to mind, typically in Latin America, a region that was plagued by financial problems and financial crises is the fiscal space. Typically, we think that Latin American countries that have a high borrowing cost are always on the brink of financial stress, and because of that, the space for fiscal stimuli was more limited, and that's the reason why the public sector could actually offset most of the shock. But if we look into specific countries, I mean, obviously there are cases like Argentina, Venezuela, that were limited by their financing sources, but many countries in Latin America were issuing at relatively reasonable cost during the COVID episode, particularly after a very short-lived financial flight to quality episode, I would say in the second quarter. It wasn't longer than that, in the second quarter of 2020. So the fiscal base, yes, it played a role. The fiscal stimuli in general was below those in developed economies, but it was not the key reason, actually. We have to, and that's possibly one of the key insights of these discussions, that there are other more micro-oriented or socioeconomic, more structural-oriented reasons behind the regional underperformance. And so here I would summarize something that is developed in more detail during the conversations, but at least there are two key deficits that were revealed, although we have long known that these two were problems in Latin America, but they were highlighted during the crisis. The first one was the importance, I would say the macroeconomic importance of business and labor informality. That's something that explains to a large extent why, even though some countries, I can think of the first country that comes to mind is Peru, for instance, some countries had actually access to relatively inexpensive international finance and they had the money, they had the physical space, they couldn't avoid a dramatic underperformance in terms of health outcomes, but also in terms of growth down rates. And what do I mean by business and labor informality? Well, essentially, two things. If you think of the key channels through which the public sector tried to offset or support the economy against the COVID shock, well, the two main channels were essentially credit, subsidized credit or credit guarantees to SMEs and companies in general, and job retention programs similar to the Kurzarbeit in Germany, which means money to the companies so the companies keep paying workers that because of the lockdowns or different MPIs were forced to stay at home in order to preserve the job relationship and avoid or limit the job destruction during the crisis. And these two channels were require that both the company and the worker are formal. They require formal channel. So if we look at the impact of credit guarantees, for instance, on the one hand, and the impact of the size of the job retention programs, it's easy to see how this highlighted the duality of both businesses and labor in this economy, because typically large and medium-sized companies receive the credit guarantees or the subsidized credit, and leaving out the micro and small companies where most of labor is on the one hand. On the other, most of these job retention programs favored state, obviously public sector workers, particularly formal employees, which are generally 30 to 20% of the total workforce, informal employees in Latin America. Something that's also common to other developing countries. So as a result, most of this fiscal stimuli was directed through, let's say, half of the company, of the economy, particularly the economy with higher income, leaving out both informal companies, small companies, and informal workers that were left with the welfare window, so to speak, which was obviously poorer, it was smaller and more limited. So that's one of the key reasons why, even if you have the money, the impact on inequality and poverty was dramatic. To that, we can add that this setback into the impact of MPIs on health outcomes, because if you have a country where your income protection and money doesn't reach the poor people, these poor people have to go out and keep working, because otherwise they don't have the money to pay for the bills, to pay for food. So the compliance with MPIs was weaker, and that created a negative feedback circle that explains why many of these countries had to implement exceptionally long lockdowns instead of the more intermittent policies that we've seen in developed economies. The other aspect, micro or structural aspect that the crisis revealed, besides the traditional macro fiscal limitations, was the inadequate state capacity. And this is very difficult to measure, but we've seen how, for instance, the same budgets were hard to implement, under executed, both in terms of health policies and in terms of, for instance, education policies. One thing that comes many times in the discussions is the persistent scar that this COVID crisis will live in terms of education losses that were very hard to recover. And those education losses are directly related with the lack of a capacity, of state capacity to actually implement remote education, for instance, because of lack of preparedness, because of poor connectivity, even inadequate human capital, teachers that were not digitally trained. So that might seem trivial, but once we compute all the costs, including this persistent cost, this is an essential issue that is usually not the first thing that comes to mind when we think of Latin American economies, but it's very relevant in terms of the medium-term aspects. So what is it that we see in the aftermath? I mean, how are we now, the day after, assuming that this pandemic is behind us or largely behind us? What is it that this pandemic leave us? Well, first off, obviously, we have higher debt durations, and the first section, will elaborate on that. Talked a lot about this. To what extent this fiscal stimuli that actually led to some extent, because most of them were financed through debt instruments, led to an increase in debt ratios. To what extent this impairs growth, or at least conditions economic policies in the future, in the near future. Then, of course, we mentioned that something is obvious. There is an increase in poverty and inequality due to the fact that we have a crisis, we have growth constructions, but in particular because of the dual nature of the economy, through which nature that actually explains why, even if the fiscal stimulus was there, the poor were largely left behind or suffered the most. We have to emphasize that this region, on average, came from a period and few years of growth underperformance. So we were not doing well comparatively before COVID. So we are starting from a weak point. And obviously we have an inflation problem, which is global, but in particular is something that we've seen in the past year. I mean, many of these countries have increased inflation in 2021 as the result of the fiscal stimulus that was to some extent in many countries, to a large extent, financed through monetary expansions. So these are charts that actually illustrate what I said before. If you look at the growth downgrades, which, as I said, is probably the best proxy of how much this pandemic hit the growth perspective, you think that that Latin American countries were the most negatively affected. And if you look at the right-hand side chart, you see that the last years prior to the pandemic, growth in the region was below the world average. And the same with the actual GDP growth. It was the contraction was actually the largest in the country. And if you look at the table, seeing how inflation generally, leaving aside some outliers like Argentina, in general, went up and imposed yet an additional challenge to monitoring generally economic policy. Because one thing that we have to bear in mind, and something that we will come back to, is the following. Here we have a very particular, very delicate challenge, because we have, on the one hand, overstretched fiscal account, fiscal balances, and I mentioned the higher debt ratio. So some degree of fiscal unwinding needs to be done. On the other, we have the aftermath of the war, essentially the aftermath of a huge crisis, socioeconomic crisis, with a number of a great mistrust of the regimes, people, increasing poverty and inequality, a society that is not prepared for a rapid adjustment, right? And the key question, which we will come back at the end of the presentation, is, how can we engineer as policymakers a gradual adjustment in a context in which society in general has suffered so much and has such a limited scope for further adjustment and further thought, crisis thought. So I will leave here because Ilan actually will elaborate on the main highlights of the conversation, and then we will resume with the conclusions.
So, good morning, good afternoon. In some other places, it's a pleasure to be with Alejandro, Carmen, Eduardo in this panel is always very nice. I'm gonna summarize the conversation where we've 16 top economists, and you will only get just a glimpse of the richness of what they said. So I encourage you to look at the ebook. Let me here share that part where we try to do a summary. So let me go just fast on the part that Eduardo talked. And this is the section 1, is avoiding the next crisis. We had dialogue with Laura Alfaro, Roberto Chang, Jose de Gregorio, Federico Schutzenegger, and basically on the macro lessons from the COVID crisis and what to do to avoid the next crisis. So we basically summarize it by saying that, as Eduardo mentioned, most of the conversation were concerned about how we're going to get out of this spending in the COVID era. You'll have less fiscal space. Most concluded that public debt may increase a bit farther in the years to come. It will be harder to consolidate. There is a risk of debt overhang and financing difficulties. So not all of them, you'll see that there is an exception, but most of them were concerned about debt issues. And if the crisis arises next time around, they all agree that we need to be more focused, more calibrated, to act faster, and in some cases even avoid policy overreaction. You cannot overspend if you don't have fiscal space. On the monetary side, there was always the question, can you do more? Can you finance these fiscal problems in emerging economies, especially in Latin America? And most of them say this will backfire. We should keep focusing on price and financial stability. They don't see a convincing argument for going into monetary financing, with even more drastic impact on inflation. Even before we got to this more clear increase in interest rates in advanced economies that we are seeing this month or the previous month, there were already dialogues that were contemplating the possibility of higher global interest rates. And what will that do? And as we know, the status fact in emerging market in Latin America, where there is tightening in advanced economy, that means less capital flows, more pressures in the countries. And that's the second point here, that higher levels of debt and interest rates on the rise will make macro financial management more challenging in the future. So they were not expecting the Ukraine war, but they were expecting higher interest rates, and what this can always mean a challenge to Latin America. On section 2, we had conversation with Marcela Slava, Ricardo Hausmann, Rodrigo Valdez, and Alejandro Werner, where we discuss growth, lost decades, the underperformance of Latin America before, during, and after COVID. This is a more generalized problem in Latin America. And we talk about the persistent scars coming from this shock. We believe that the growth is expected to be below the pre-pandemic path, which means that the level will be below. Some reasons for challenges on that. Possible macroeconomic problems. We know them: high inflation, financial fragility, business environment, lack of appropriate governance, in some cases, a natural resource curse leading to extractive, weak institutions and short-sighted horizons, social issues, political conflicts, and not least, institutional hurdles to build consensus around policies for medium-term growth. So this permanent below the pandemic is what the conversation and the economies fear. In addition, we do know that we have slow technological progress that widens the region's technological gap with advanced world. So we don't have enough investment in technology. We don't have enough incentives to do this in the region. And this is one of the structural issues that needs to be addressed. And the education deficits mean that local talents will remain underutilized. So one of the main scars, and you'll see in the next session, is education going forward. There's always the discussion of universal policies. So we use them in the region. Given the past and the lessons, most of the conversations were skeptical that in Latin America, we could efficiently substitute for the right market signals incentives through a development strategy that is not based on horizontal policies. This is, of course, present in other regions, but our past has given our economy some skepticism that can be used in Latin America, and they propose more largely based on horizontal policies. Section 3 is very important. Social challenges ahead. Francisco Ferreira, Chico, Nora, Lustig, and Eric Payado, they discuss the social aspect of the economy, its impact and challenges. And it's quite interesting because they have seen that the pandemic increased inequality in several dimensions. Income, gender, climate issues, and other inequalities that appear, as well as poverty for those living in poorer areas. We have the informal workers that Eduardo mentioned in the introduction, and of course, minorities suffered the most from the pandemic. So that the impact was not uniform, and inequalities have increased. The other issue that was part of the conversation important was that the substantial number of households transitioned to poverty, given the shock. So that has to be taken into account in the coverage for social programs. So you cannot just look at the poverty, have a program, but you have to think about what happens with this chunk of the population that, given the shock, will transition to poverty. Maybe we should, and replacing existing target programs by universal income programs will leave the poor worse off. We need to focus, especially because of the section 1 where we talk about the fiscal space. And as I mentioned, early education's losses may be the Latin American greatest and longer lasting scar from COVID-19. The private sector has a tremendously important role in the coming years because of space. The fiscal unwinding will need to be implemented in a social responsible way. So we cannot deal with the section 1, which is the fiscal space and debts, without taking into account social responsible way to do it. So we are now also thinking about what to do with this point. Last but not least, there were quite a bit of political developments. So we talk about them in the future of democracy in Latin America with Edmar Basha, Emilio Fraga, Andrea Repeto, and Andres Velasco that reflect on the protests, the social discontent in the region, the political environment, and what to do with that, what is the relevant driver, why is that, and what is the consequence. So some of them say that the macroeconomic indicators the last 30 years, even in countries like Chile with high growth and impressive falling poverty, some reduction in inequality, do not capture the essential dimensions of inequality and the perception surrounding it. So even though you look at the indicators, and in some cases they have improved, some cases they have improved quite a bit, seems not to be the whole picture. They emphasize that the tolerance for income inequality and fairness changes in the course of development. And the frustration comes with the present and disillusion with the future. So you may have improved relative to the past, but you look at the present, you look at the future, and come after a bout of improvement that have recently stalled. So you look at the present, it's stalled, you forget the past, and if the future looks worse than the present, or doesn't continue to improve, it erodes the trust in the relationships, it leads to people to believe that institutions are flawed, and then you get anger and protest. So most of them in the conversation, you'll see they believe that societies are experiencing political fractures, given that. And part of the protests are also linked to social networks that have moved institutions and protests around the world. Some are even bolder, and they think that we will end up reinventing social democracy in a way that addresses the key issues of our time: growth that is sustainable on access with the world, financially, environmentally, and socially, although they acknowledge that success is far from assured. Some of them believe that the only solution is have this more sustainable growth in all senses, but even they believe that this is not a sure thing. It's quite a challenge. And most argue that political and economic reforms, that we need them, as we saw in the other sections, that put the general interest first in providing goods and services that are essential to the public, are badly needed. So you need to focus on the people, you need to focus on what they need to focus on what they're telling you they want, the services. That's the only way you can repair the social problems and the issues with democracies in the region. So I will go to the conclusion and I will pass to Eduardo. I may comment also a little bit, but let Eduardo start, please.
In the conclusions, we address and ask actually our colleagues whether we are facing a new lost decade in Latin America. It's always the first reaction in Latin America because we have been performing so modestly, to say the least, that the first thing that comes to mind is, okay, so we're going to lose another one. I think that the obviously we don't know. I mean, there is the answer to that is depends on policy, but I think it's worth emphasizing something that comes from many sides and from many of the questions, many of these sections. And it's interesting because we are here in the panel for macroeconomists. And as macroeconomists, we have in the past typically think in terms of debt and fiscal space and macro effects or the macro consequences of a crisis. And one thing that it's highlighted in the book, and I think it's becoming more trendy and more consensual, is that we cannot keep thinking, at least in Latin America, of macro policy without introducing two other aspects, which are very salient in the previous discussion. The first one is obviously, we would call it the microeconomic aspect, although this difference is kind of artificial. It's more the social labor side of this equation, right? If we have informality, poverty, exclusion, many of the policies, in particular fiscal policies during the COVID pandemic, were ineffectual or were half effective. Were effective for actually the people that they needed this the least. And on the other side, there is what we could call a political space, essentially, because we have seen fiscal fatigue, in particular, have seen a socioeconomic fatigue for further adjustment and an increasing and growing civil unrest and social demands for a change in the system that were interrupted, briefly during the pandemic because of the lockdown that came back to the foreground in recent in the last year, and it's still something very important. We are not talking about outliers like Venezuela, Argentina, or Nicaragua. We're talking about Chile. We're talking about Colombia, Brazil, probably during this year. So So there are two dimensions that are intimately related, intertwined with the macroeconomic dimensions of the post-crisis, the micro one and the political one. Right? And the key challenge that comes to, and the question that comes as a conclusion of this exercise that we conducted with our colleagues is that we have to think policy making for Latin America, at least, I would say more generally, but for Latin America at least, taking these three spaces simultaneously, the fiscal space, the macroeconomic space, the social space, and also the political space. That is the capacity, the political capacity of leadership in Latin America to actually move forward with some of the what would be the traditional recommendations of economists, because everybody, most of the analysts agree that we have to some extent to move forward with some fiscal unwinding, because at the end of the day, particularly in a context of steepening yield curves and raising interest rates in the world, and we're not even talking about the current war in Ukraine, we are exposed, financially exposed, if we don't do anything. But we cannot do that in the old-fashioned way, just move forward with fiscal increase in taxes or reduction in spending, because there are some additional considerations to take into account. The other thing I would like to highlight, and just to, as an introduction to whatever Ilan has to add to that, is that there is a divide within Latin America generally. Brazil, and to a large extent Argentina, has gone through the increase in taxes period in the 2000s, particularly in Argentina in the early 2000s, the increase in 10% public revenues and spending. But most of the other Latin American economies have grown in income, but they haven't grown their fiscal space, their revenues, pari passu with the increase in real income. So some of the recommendations that comes in terms of where to start to reduce the stretch of these fiscal accounts comes from a reasonable, fair, progressive increase in taxes. And there seems to be, at least that's more or less the consensus among our colleagues, there seems to be space to increase taxes in order to enhance the menu of social services and public services and transfers that are at the core of the social demand in previous years. So that's one of the highlights, I think, of the discussion. And I imagine one of the lines of the research, and particularly policy innovations, that most of us expect in Latin America, as I said, with the exception of countries that have done that and probably squandered that in the past. Now, Ilan, back to you.
And just to complement that, these spaces that Eduardo mentions, fiscal space, the social space, the political space, all have to take into account. So when you look at Latin America, you know that we have to deal with debts and fiscal spaces and consolidation, but we also have to deal with social issues, social discontent. So it may seem to some that this is an impossible task, but I think we can rise to the challenge in the sense that we can have consolidations that are inclusive, that changes the compositions of spending, or as Eduardo mentioned, the composition of taxes. We need to have this type of joint exercise where you deal with the places where you don't have fiscal space, but in a way that you don't forget the social space. And at the same time, you need to deal with growth, more structural growth. And that means that you need to lay the ground for that, because that's the only way that you will have people looking at the future and looking at better perspectives than you have today. It's a challenge, but I think it can be done. So I think that although the diagnosis of our conversation with 16 economists are very realistic and looking at the issues and pointing out the Latin America's pitfalls and what has been happening in the past and is challenging in the future. I think we can try, and I think the economists in the in the presentations. We're also looking at the future with the answer to our question whether there's another lost decade. They have not answered yes. They answered we don't know, but I sense some light in the end of the tunnel in their remarks. Thank you very much. And let me just stop sharing so we can go to Alejandro and Carmen.
Thank you, Ilan. Thank you, Eduardo. Let's go straight to Carmen's comments.
Can you hear me now and see the screen? Very good.
It's perfect.
Well, it's sort of like an extended family. I reading, the 16 authors, the 2 editors. So you will see that which I don't think I've ever done in a set of slides is referred to people in their first name. What I'm going to try to do is, there's so much that I agree there. It spans a lot of areas. So I'm going to be selective. And what I'm going to try to do is also very much coming from many of the same observations that we just heard from Eduardo and from Ilan, and from the book, but give it sort of a somewhat different historic reinterpretation of where we are. And then, of course, because it's always, it wouldn't be a truly Latin American if you didn't disagree on something. I'm going to take issue on some of the authors' views on inflation, for example. How benign is it? How, so there's going to be an element also of forward-looking, apart from what Eduardo and Ilan have, focus more on the growth side and in some sense on the, social policy and fiscal policy. I'm going to tackle a little bit on the inflation. So it's very complementary to what you have heard. That's sort of my plan. And if I could actually move the, let's see, there we are. Okay. So this is the list. I've already highlighted what I'm going to do, so I don't need to really repeat myself. Let me also say that this, the book is on Latin America. However, there's a certain skewness. And, this lists the mentions of each country in the text. And so I think to say that relative to country size, certainly Chile appears a tad overrepresented. And I have to say, of course, I'm Cuban born and coming from Cuba, and given Ilan, I think, referred to the issue of outliers, Eduardo did too, but we certainly have a number of outliers in the region, and not on the good tail end of the distribution. Right now, the government actually, admitted that their best estimate of inflation in the informal sector right now is running around 6,900%. And of course, there's a massive output contraction, but we've seen elements of this played out in Venezuela before. But let me turn now to really my presentation. I don't want to be pedantic, but this is important. When I talk about recovery, this is important for the discussion, that when I talk about recovery, I'm going to be talking about having at least the same level of per capita income that you had before the crisis. And in some cases, COVID was not the first round decline, but a second round decline. In effect, per capita incomes have been declining already. Okay, so recovery to me and this is the definition that I've been using for years, means you have surpassed your prior peak in per capita income. That's recovery, just for clarity. I'm gonna go through this quickly because I want to hone down on the region, but I think, and this is a point that Francisco makes, and many of the authors make, and COVID has been a very unequal shock. If you look at the share of countries that meet the recovery criteria, it's not spectacular even in advanced economies, right? It's about 40%. But by the time you move down the income ladder, with LATAM in the middle, it's much lower. It's a very regressive shock, and the regressive problem is something I'm going to focus on throughout, and it's very much in the book. I think this is, to me, I want to put this in historic perspective. If you look at the history of LATAM, it is often characterized by the way Cubans say, tres para adelante, dos para atrás. You know, you move 3 steps forward and you take 2 back. And often, sometimes you do the reverse. You take 2 steps forward and you take 3 steps back. These are long cycles in which it isn't just about income. It isn't just the macro factors. It's the social, it's the political, because weakened economic activity, you know, a shrinking pie, a worse distributed pie often will lead to political turmoil. And so these long cycles of prosperity, you know, sort of the biblical 7 fat cows and 7 lean cows. And I'm going to try to frame some of the discussion, because you notice that in both Ilan's and Eduardo's presentation, and also in the book, there's sort of the recurring things. Well, things weren't going so well even before COVID. So this is just not a COVID shock. And what I highlight here, this is a very simple, you know, using the WIO October, I'm sure, and WIO, let me say, is on the optimistic side. So, you know, the odds that this table looks worse when we get the new WIO are pretty good. The point being, if you look at the countries in the region, yes, you know, a good bit of them, the peak was 2019, just before COVID, but a good number of them already had been seeing significant contraction in income, and the median, I'm not even going with the average, because obviously you take a look at Venezuela and you take a look at Haiti in the region, and you know, this is a different, the median as of 2021, median performance was pretty abysmal. That is, per capita incomes were still 7% below the prior peak. And in effect, the distance from the prior peak is about 3.5 years. So the concept that we're in a lost decade, I think we were already entering that phase before COVID. COVID has accelerated. And this is what I call it. I'm working with Art Cray and Eduardo Levy Yeyati. This reversal problem, by the way, is at the moment not unique to LATAM. It is very pronounced in LATAM, but it's there. You know, it's there in other regions. It's there in you know, varying degrees. More acute, most acute in Africa, but it's in every region in different degrees. The issue of the reversal problem, which is a broader thing than just per capita income, but refers to a lot of the social indicators as well. On inflation, and this is, you know, we're not dealing with sort of the, oh, is you know, in LATAM going off on, you know, back to the old days. This is not the question at hand. This is a global phenomenon here. And it's hitting the core. And it's hitting the core. I'm not going to go into the reasons because, you know, for interest of time, But, you know, I think Federico and Pepo, Jose de Gregorio, and Roberto Chang all are sort of rather optimistic. This is, you know, temporary. You know, as I like to remind people that few things in life are permanent, but many are quite persistent. And I think the inflation phenomenon that we're seeing has very, many similarities to the issues we saw in the 70s, including an insufficient response from the Fed, okay? Which lets the process become more ingrained. So it's not entirely a supply shock story either. Certainly what is happening in the Ukraine and Russia, I'm bringing this up because there was a question in the chat to that effect. You know, what's happening in Ukraine and Russia reinforces a lot of the issues, you know, the problems with supply chains, shipping costs have been skyrocketing. What is this? What am I'm not going to ramble about global inflation. I'm talking particular, and I think there's a challenge that LATAM, because of a history of high inflation, I think tends to see perhaps, you know, more rapid pass-through, more rapid adjustment in expectations than in other places. So again, broadening the base, and this is still on inflation, but in a very social dimension. Part of the inequality issue is that inflation is a very regressive tax. And a lot of the increases have been concentrated in food and fuel, which of course are the biggest chunk of the household baskets, and it hits the lower income. And this feeds into, you know, a lot of the themes that were discussed also by Andres Velasco and others on you know, discussing some of the political and social dimensions. I do think, and this is a part that hasn't really, and now we get back to more questions on the policy side of the kind that Eduardo and Ilan were talking about. If the going gets really rough on external financing, and it is difficult to reduce budget deficits, and it is always difficult to reduce budget deficits, the temptation to finance government domestic debt through the central bank, those pressures will be there. They're going to be there in the advanced economy. At the prospects of a reversal in inflation. I'm not going to go through this because there's no time, but it makes the point that exits from global negative, significantly sustained and negative real interest rates, exits have been rare, and they have not been associated with a lot of stability. They've been tough periods. I'm not just flagging, obviously, because this is the one best known to everyone here, the exit from the 1980s, the exit of the 1980s, but that you know, sets the stage for what I'm going to talk about next, which is debt issues. This chart shows external debt servicing as a percent of exports. And this is for, the solid line is for Western Hemisphere, and the dashed line is for some of the big countries. What is interesting about this chart is debt servicing has been going up. National interest rate.
I think we lost Carmen.
Let's wait a minute just to see if the signal comes back. You're muted,
You're
Carmen.
muted.
Okay.
Carmen will have to mute
All right,
yourself.
there, okay. Very quickly, I'll wrap up. I mean, apologies, but I had not had an unstable connection for a long time. Bottom line is, the good news is there's not a lot of short-term debt to have an immediate impact on debt servicing, but the share of variable rate debt is very high. It's close to an all-time high. It's about 50%, 48.5% for some of the major advanced economies. So the impacts, the vulnerability impacts of rising interest rates is something that should be concerned, be perhaps an even bigger source of concern. To Nora's point and Francisco's point, the issue of poverty comparatively, this is taken from the Poverty and Shared Prosperity, the latest of the World Bank. LATAM has not done very well, but I think we all know that. But what I keep harping on is the broad-based reversal. This is a reversal problem. And I'll conclude here by saying that, this is the share of countries, this is the Freedom Index from Freedom House, and maybe it's all spurious, right? But the correlation between the incidence of democracy and the threats to democracy and economic performance seems to be a pretty tight one. And that's also been on the reverse. So I've rushed through this because there's a lot there. But, I'd like to leave the view that this reversal problem was really exacerbated by COVID. But as we heard from Eduardo and Ilan and the authors, there were a lot of problems even before COVID. And we can go into that in the discussion. I think, as Andres argues, if economic reversals lead to policy reversals, which they did in the 1980s, and the LATAM has been notorious for policy reversals in its history, then the problems can be the scarring that Eduardo and Ilan talked about is bound to be more lasting. And I was left with a situation, a mind frame after reading the essays and the intro, that if the best scenario is actually a muddling through, that there isn't something that jumps out at you that says, okay, this is one angle that, there are these kinds of changes that are really going to catalyze things. So it's on that uplifting note, let me conclude.
Thank you very much, Carmen. I share your views, and just very quickly, when we started kind of saying this issue about the lost decade, we from the IMF, when I was there, we came from the same point that you're coming, kind of saying since the end of the commodity boom in 2014, 2015, Latin America GDP per capita has been coming down. So this is kind of the second major shock for the region. So at least if you look from 2015 to 2025, it's highly likely that GDP per capita is not going to be much higher than where we were in 2015, and most likely will be below. And I think your complement to the presentation by Ilan and Eduardo was superb in terms of getting to the details of the debt, inflation, poverty, and in that sense, I think we have a great view on the challenges for Latin America. In the interest of time, let me just give each of you 1 minute to finish on time. Questions were on the role of corruption, on the war in Ukraine and sanctions in Russia, how it's going to affect the region. Something on that was maybe missing from our discussion was the potential for integration into the world economy, or maybe this whole thing about nearshoring and reallocation of activity, being in Latin America an area that it's not part of the geopolitical reshuffling that might be an opportunity. I would say, what is the IMF space to support countries given this space of much higher vulnerability going forward? And also maybe a question on how does the whole emphasis of the world towards climate change, and how can Latin America address that? Is that an opportunity, or that's actually another important challenge that might hold up development and growth in the region? With that, let's start in the reverse order. Let's start just final 1 minute comments with you, Carmen, then Eduardo, and then Ilan.
So a 1 minute comment. Look, I don't think the Russia-Ukraine, it's not over till it's over. I alluded to the inflationary effects of that over the shorter term, but that these could be quite persistent. But another feature that hasn't been mentioned, that's been dead, but very important for LATAM over many years, was the word contagion. We had plenty of it in the 1990s. Contagion was more limited to the advanced economies during the global financial crisis, but I think that's a risk. And just very quickly in on IMF support, I think one thing we need to bear in mind, and I think many more countries, not just in LATAM, but in many regions, will be working with the IMF. I don't think they'll be out of a job anytime soon, Ilan. So I think you'll be very, very busy. The issue of repayment. We've gone through the IMF is the rock star and the World Bank are the rock star because they're lending. But when those debts start, and we're getting already a preview of this with Argentina, when they start getting repaid. When I started at the IMF many years ago, there were, the streets had to be closed off because of protests during the annual meeting. So it depends. The question, and I'll conclude here, on the horizon. If you're talking about the, initial stages, more lending, but there will come a time for repayment, and that will be tough.
Thanks, Carmen. Eduardo?
Very terrific. Okay, there is not one Latin America, so the impact of the Ukraine war in terms of inflation, in terms of trade, will differ relatively according to the position, the trade position of each country. I think it will be overall inflationary. In that, I think I agree with pretty much everybody. Regarding the IMF, this is something for Ilan to answer, but the IMF, even during COVID pandemic, and even with this almost no conditionality emergency assistance, was under requested, in a sense they were expecting certain amount of lending, and the actual lending was half of that. So there is something. For sure, they will have some role to play because of what we have said in terms of debt finance and the increase in interest rates. But still, that the same as I mentioned with Peru, fiscal space that couldn't be actually executed. Sometimes the amount of capital that is there and is demanded is not actually executed because of, let's say, some political stigmas and structural issues that we need to analyze. I'm actually working on that, but still I don't have a clear answer to that. But even if the money is there, the countries may face a financial stress and not request IMF full assistance, which is a remaining enigma. The default case is that we will have another lost decade. That's not very innovative in terms of conclusion. But since we are, researchers and on occasion policymakers, we need to think how to avoid that. So actually the challenge is to think ways in which we can at least mitigate the impact. But obviously the default scenario is one that is not, it's not dismal, but it's not really very promising, given the pre-COVID performance, but more importantly, given the combination of fiscal, political, and social demands that are very difficult to reconcile in practice. So I'm cautiously optimistic, but realistically, things don't look so good. And finally, I think that in terms of connotation, one thing that is interesting, and I agree with what Carmen presented, I think that the profile of the debt in most of Latin American countries is better than in the past, and that might, on a positive note, that might reduce the exposure to financial contagion in the near future. Regarding real contagion associated with the world, I can't say much because this is something that's a moving target. But in terms of financial issues, I think the financial exposure in terms of dollar shares or short-term debt are, I think, below what we've seen in the late 90s. So I hope that the scenario will not repeat. Thank you.
Thank you, Eduardo. Ilan.
Yeah, thank you very much, Carmen, for the comments and the questions. When one of the questions asked, we have not addressed the issue of more integration, more insertion in the rest of the world. I think that's quite relevant, and I think for some of the countries in the region, this is a very important aspect for structural growth that we need to do. But it's also true that this integration, insertion is not uniform. We do have countries in Latin America much more integrated than the rest. And that brings me to the other question, which is, can we see all Latin America at once? That is the effort we need in this book, to look at the region as a whole, see the similarities. But of course, when you look at not only integration, but if you look at other aspects, there are quite a bit of diversity in the region. So the effort is to look at the aspects that are common, social issues, political issues, long-term growth. All of them are more common than different, but other aspects, yes, are different. So, for example, Carmen mentioned inflation, and quite a bit of the countries in the region are now facing inflation, but some of the main ones are still able to anchor expectations. But then the diversity is there, as Carmen mentioned. There are countries that we call them outliers, but they have high inflation. So even in inflation, yes, we have two groups, a group of very high inflation and a group that is trying to make this shock be temporary by raising interest rates, by using monetary policy to anchor expectations in order to avoid having a more persistent effect and keep expectations anchored in the long term. So far for this group has been okay. I think they have managed to do that, but they have to remain vigilant as they go forward. On the main aspect, on these different dimensions that we have to deal with Latin America, it is not possible to deal them separately, like debt and fiscal space and social separately and structural growth. I think we will need to deal them at the same time. I think we don't have the option. So when we have consolidations, we will have to have inclusive consolidations that change the compositions, because that's the only way to do it. And when you think about long-term growth and whether we're going to have lost decades, which is a question we posed the economists here, we will have to deal with education, social issues to education, and things that also increase productivity at the same time. So this is quite a bit of a challenge, but it's not impossible, and we should be looking at that for the future. Thank you, and Alejandro, back to you.
Thank you. I mean, Ilan, thank you, Eduardo. Thank you, Carmen, for a very deep and enlightening discussion. As you say, I mean, the discussion is not whether we're going to have a lost decade or not in terms of statistics, but it's what can be done, and would the region be able to have the degree of political consensus to actually be able to move ahead an agenda that has to be implemented in so many dimensions, to start a process that maybe goes beyond the lost decade, but starts putting the right blocks to regain an inclusive growth path for many of the countries in the region. It looks very challenging. It looks that we're coming out of the pandemic without the type of political agreements that would sustain that, as Carmen laid out. But that's a big challenge for Latin American societies going forward. And again, let me thank you for putting together this volume, and let me thank Carmen for joining us and for her great comments, and thank everybody that joined us this morning. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.